Okay, everyone. Hope you enjoyed a good lunch. And thanks again for being here. Now, I know that you're at different tables for different specializations, different programs. And what we're going to work on for an hour or so is a kind of structured conversation. Just sharing some ideas, and please, that's the emphasis, sharing thoughts that come to your mind about the core goals of courses and programs, and the way we can make certain that what we promise to offer our students, we actually deliver. And that's a pretty simple way of explaining what was for me a kind of bizarre term, curriculum mapping, when I was first introduced to this idea. The assessment of student learning, it takes place in many stages, in many ways. And it starts with the identification of what we're trying to achieve, our learning outcomes. Course level, curriculum level, program level, institutional level. Yeah, it's a head full of stuff. But here's something I want you to keep in mind as we go through this process. If these issues are not clear and meaningful to us, what in the world are our students going to think? How will it make sense to them? So let's just think about the responsibility we bear for the clarification of these issues. Having identified these outcomes, trying to understand where they occur and how they occur. Where they occur and how they occur. This can also be tied in. How do we know they're occurring? What are students learning? At what level? Gathering that evidence, using the results. And I don't mean using the results just to deliver it to the Higher Learning Commission. I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have taken on this job if that's the end point of all this work. The end point is what's happening with your students. The end point is the satisfaction you feel at the end of a semester. Did a class work? Not just an evaluation, I liked this professor. Did students take away something meaningful from this work? And just continually going around in this, what does seem like an endless circle, and it is, because it's the kind of thing we want to revisit again and again. Because of what everybody in an institution of higher education understands. Our knowledge doesn't stop at 2018. It's going to keep changing. And as folks at two-year institutions know, we've got to make our institutions keep changing for these new conditions. Why do this mapping? It's the way we can figure out a bit more clearly as a group, not just as individuals, as colleagues, how we're teaching, and what our students are learning. And see this in terms of the structure of learning, the sequence of learning, the pathway of learning, the organization of our programs. Just to put that kind of lens on, rather than thinking of this as one instructor, one course. Thinking of this movement from my course to our curriculum. And this is what we clarify when we do this. Where learning occurs, what exercises we're doing to promote that learning, the level of these assignments, if they're just introducing issues, if they're developing skills, and how we appropriate these outcomes for our programs. Or how appropriate? How appropriate are these for our programs? It's a way of discovering if we're just veering off into the distance and not really focusing on central questions. Fortunately, speaking as a historian with no training in this, it's actually pretty easy. And even I can figure it out. Because it's basically a two-dimensional outline. What are your program outcomes? What are the courses in that program? And faculty identify which courses address which outcomes. You could take it another step. What level? What exercises? And how is it assessed? That's pretty abstract. Let me just show you what it looks like. And again, folks, you don't need a PhD to figure this out. You don't need any graduate training to figure this out. It's very commonsensical. Here. SLO, Student Learning Outcomes, and courses. Let's say I teach course 104. Which of those outcomes do I address in the course? I want my colleagues to know what I think I accomplished in that course. Here's what we've agreed to for our outcomes. Here's what I'm trying to provide in this course, and maybe I teach 203 as well. What do I provide there? What's the whole secret here? It's so you can avoid what we faced in our department 10 years ago. The faculty member who raised his hands and said, I'll tell you what the biggest problem is. Students come into the capstone course and they can't do this, 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 and this. And 24 people with PhDs sat around the table and it suddenly dawned on them. We'd never talked about this. We just assumed our students could do it, even though no one was teaching this and this and this and this. That was an embarrassing moment for us. To spare you that embarrassment, a curriculum map can be helpful because you can learn pretty early, are we missing steps? So for each outcome that you've decided on, which courses address it? If you've got these outcomes listed, there better be some X marks here, right? Otherwise, there's another conversation to have. Who can bring this outcome into their course? B. Is that really not an essential outcome? Again, if you've got columns here with no X marks, you got a problem. Now, it's not going to be necessarily serious, but you do need to talk about it as colleagues. Here's what we're promising to deliver. Here's a hole in the program. Now you can take this a second level. Start with that first one. What level of work do you do on that outcome? Is an outcome introduced in a course? Yeah, you're going to have a lot of these. Is it, the language varies here. Is the outcome practiced? Is it reinforced? Is it developed? Don't get too hung up on those words. Or is it mastered? Is there something that's the equivalent of a capstone? The real test case on the skills and knowledge that your program is trying to develop. And you can address outcomes at more than one level. Now, using that same simple outline, student learning outcomes courses, Course 104 introduces this, just hypothetical, introduces learning outcome 1 at 2 levels. It's a practice on this, and then at the end there's a mastery of it. Who determines these letters, the level? You do. What do you do in your course? Can you do everything? No. No one's expecting that of you. You can't in 15 weeks. Be reasonable. What do I honestly focus on, and at what level? Does my course talk about an outcome, discuss it, develop it? At what level? 3, what do you do to address the outcome? Same model here. So let's say course 102 would have an X next to it. Yeah, I address this outcome. Let's say the letter would be P. Students are practicing this, and we do it through lab experiments. I hope this is understandable. Yeah. You want to take this further? This may be beyond today's work. How do you assess that outcome? Well, there are all kinds of assessment. Remember, I showed on the earlier slide, in that tiny, tiny font, all these ways of assessing student learning. There's no one way. What's the method you're using? Direct methods, indirect methods? You're using rubrics, you're using surveys, job placement rates, completion rates, and putting that onto a graph. Here's what we promise to do. Here are the courses that offer this. Where can students find this knowledge and skills? And at what level? Through which exercises? And how do we evaluate the learning? That's curriculum mapping. And then as a group, you look at this and think, okay, is it filled out? Are there gaps? Oh, I'm sorry, you can also map out any kind of learning. In courses and student affairs and extracurricular work, it depends on your program. What are you offering? This is the wake-up call. When you work as a group, do your assumptions actually pan out? Do you and your colleagues have some kind of consistent ideas on what these outcomes are? And frankly, a lot of colleagues have to work through this. Outcomes can exist on paper. What happens in practice? It's something I've noted with European colleagues who are great at posting all kinds of long lists about outcomes. And then I ask them a simple question, what practical difference does that make in your classroom? And nobody's got an answer for it because they've spent all their time filling out a form. But if there isn't consistency for us, how do students figure it out? What do you think is a way to align with an outcome? Look, very frank, and this is I can't answer this. Your colleagues have to answer it with you. Is one paper in one class enough within an outcome to say the outcome is met? Now, how much is enough? There's no formula for this. And this is why I stressed in the morning, what's at the key of all this work? Just talking with one another. Just moving from teaching as very private, personal, and moving to to thinking about our teaching and learning as scholarship that we're sharing with peers. Oh, extra slides that I'm not going to bother with. Now, Cynthia, We have some sheets available. I'm wondering, folks, if you want to just start on this at one level or two levels. Question one, and let me back up here. Start with the basics. There are these large poster boards that I see in some various spots. It would be helpful, if you want to work this way, to have one person work with the group and just map out what are the program outcomes that you have already or that are tentative, and what are the courses in the program, and try step one. This is not going to be complete, but just make an effort to think about this. What are we trying to accomplish? Where are we accomplishing this? Now, Cynthia, are there markers too? Yes?
So how do you approach this with AA or AS degrees where the curriculum can come from multiple sources? There's no set.
How do you approach this from AA or AS degrees where there's no single curriculum?
Well, students have choices.
Students have choices. You start with just the group you have and the courses that are being taught, and then expand it out with more people. I mean, you work on this in your group, see what you work up, and then if it seems reasonable and satisfactory, share it with others to see how you can fill that out even more. You want to see an extra slide? Something that's absolutely impossible to read. And now I can't remember who I mentioned this to. In the fall of 2019, I'm working on a new project at our university. It's a Gen Ed program, an AS online Gen Ed program. I think there are 5 or 6, 7 disciplines that are represented. We've created some basic learning outcomes, and then we asked everybody who's operating, physicists, historians, sociologists, psychologists, to come up to a big screen and just fill in their course with each outcome. Did we get everybody? No. Did we at least make a start seeing where we are with one group? And this is how we started to fill it in with all kinds of outcomes that we've listed. Folks, I'm going to walk around the room. Would you start seeing how this works out? At least to start the conversation, and maybe taking it from one step to another. Okay, everybody, I know this is quick work. I've come to one table that's worked through this kind of exercise before, and I just want them to take a couple of minutes just to explain to the rest of you why this might be worth it, why this exercise actually has some concrete results. You want to try talking into there?
Can you hear me? All right, so we're part of the nursing program, and we just recently went through curriculum, total revision, going to concept-based nursing. So it's been 2 years, right, guys? Mm-hmm. So we actually hashed it out once, had our program objectives, and then redid each course total overhaul. So now we're at the point, what works, what didn't, because we had our first graduating class come out of it. So it was really interesting what he was talking about. Sounds so highly academic, but we just sat our last meeting or 2 meetings ago and rehashed everything. Okay, here we are, we're at the point. We noticed that there were some issues that weren't being met could go better, so we totally sat down at the table just like this, just like everyday peers talking just like he said, and said, okay guys, we need to cover this earlier. One nurse said at the higher level, we need to cover this earlier. Another said, well, we can move this later. So we just totally sat around as a group and rehashed, okay, who can cover this earlier? Another one would say, nope, can't take any more in ours. We need to cover that, later, and just totally rehashed it. So kind of found out that it's not really as high academic as what we think. It's just an everyday, just like you said, sit at the table, converse, what works, what doesn't, who can cover this, who can cover that, so that we get all of our objectives for the curriculum met at an appropriate level. And then we also we did, the whole introductory to mastery level too. What could go higher, what could go lower, and all those kind of things. And so it's a continuous process. So like we said, we did that first step, and now we're going to look at that. We tweaked. We actually took out a course and added another one when we saw that some objectives weren't met enough. So it's going to be a total process. So now we're going to see how that goes. We put back pediatrics. We had taken it out. We put it back. So now we're going to, again, revisit that when we see how that goes.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let me just kind of crudely pick both of these up. None of this was meant to be any kind of final product. This is just an introduction to a process. And the hope was that you'd feel comfortable talking to colleagues about this kind of issue and feel comfortable about something else. Just taking it to other colleagues and offering this as maybe a topic for a meeting, maybe something that a program, a major, a curriculum really has to hash out. Everybody here, every table has been working at different levels, from trying to formulate better program outcomes to working at levels of assessment. I didn't expect anybody would be getting through all of those levels. The whole point of this exercise was the point I was emphasizing all morning. All of this work just depends on us talking with our colleagues. And Ann Hyde from the University of Oklahoma, her suggestion, what are the ideals that got us into this work, and how do we best share those with students? You could take all the jargon about assessment you want. It doesn't clarify any better what all of this work is meant to do. And the key to keep understanding is faculty are the center of this. You're not marginalized. Actual faculty, actual classes, actual exercises, actual evaluations, that's what high-stakes learning is all about. I know this is a complex process. It's messy. It leads to all kinds of changes and constant revisions, and we're never satisfied with this work. That reminds me of my own scholarship, or it should remind you of your scholarship, that we always come back to this stuff. And that's what makes our educational system so exemplary. Think of this as your scholarly work in teaching and learning. Think of this from the perspective of what you can take from this to help make your class more effective and your students more successful. And somewhere down the road, you think, oh yeah, I might share some of this stuff with the Higher Learning Commission. But that's not the center of it. It's you and your students, their work, and their success. One final point, if the vocabulary itself is difficult to figure out, open up that DQP booklet all the way. Look at the violet columns that talk about the kind of reasonable expectations in 5 areas of learning at the associate's level. And see if that language might help you work out some of the statements you make about program goals and outcomes. The people that I had on the screen before, Peter Ewell, Carol Geary-Schneider, they're people responsible for this 6-year study. And that purple column, that came by constant consultation with instructors at 2-year institutions. Maybe that vocabulary can help you break through some roadblocks in just explaining or gaining access to the language that explains what you're trying to accomplish in your courses and your programs. Folks, thanks very much for working on this today.
Thank you.